Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking Apple's blacklisted RAM crisis. We're going to dive right into exactly why the richest tech company on Earth, a company facing an absolutely unprecedented supply squeeze right now, is actively courting a designated Chinese military supplier. Let's get right into it.
Just look at this stunning sequence of events because, well, the timeline here is literally everything. It's really a tale of 2 days. On a Thursday, Apple raised prices across its Mac and iPad lines. These were its first big hardware hikes in years. But then, by the weekend, the Financial Times drops a report that Apple was secretly lobbying Washington for clearance to buy memory chips from CXMT, which is a blacklisted Chinese manufacturer. I mean, when a company with pockets as deep as Apple's resorts to courting a designated military supplier just days after hiking prices, it tells us the memory crunch has become absolutely total. Let's look at exactly what those price hikes entail, so we can really wrap our heads around it. We are talking about hardware hikes of 17 to 25%. The 1TB M5 MacBook Pro, up by $300. iPad Pros are up by $200, and even the entry-level MacBook Neo jumped $100. Tim Cook actually told the Wall Street Journal flat out that they had no choice entirely due to soaring memory and storage costs driven by AI data center demand. He basically admitted these constraints are going to persist for months, effectively handing this massive headache directly to incoming CEO John Ternus right as he takes over on September 1st.
4 times. That is wild. According to data from Counterpoint Research, that's exactly how much memory prices have skyrocketed over just the past 3 quarters. It's a massive structural AI-driven reallocation of resources. Now, Apple actually held out longer than most, mostly because they had these ironclad long-term supply contracts. But, those contracts eventually ran out. And now, that insane 4x increase has turned Apple's bill of materials into a problem they simply can no longer absorb quietly.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that Apple needs more memory and they need it fast. Right now they rely on the big three, Micron, Samsung, and SK Hynix. But with those contracts expiring and prices just going through the roof, Apple is actively looking to make the Chinese manufacturer CXMT its 4th memory supplier. It's a pretty classic diversification play to stabilize their supply chain. But as you'll see in a second, it comes with some incredibly serious national security strings attached.
Okay, CXMT's legal status actually involves some really fascinating nuance. They sit on the Pentagon's 1260H list, which is a roster of Chinese military companies. But here's the key takeaway you need to know. It's really just a designation. It's not an automatic prohibition that legally blocks a commercial deal. What it does do, however, is make any such deal politically radioactive. See, the U.S. Defense Department cannot contract with 1260H firms. So an American icon like Apple sourcing RAM from one, yeah, that invites an immediate political firestorm. Because they aren't technically banned right now, Apple's whole lobbying campaign at the Commerce Department isn't really just about getting a quick permit for a one-off purchase. Their true goal is assurance. Apple wants absolutely solid confidence from the U.S. government that if they go ahead and sign a supply deal with CXMT, the Commerce Department won't turn around later and slap CXMT on the entity list. Being on the entity list would impose super strict licensing rules, completely choke off access to U.S. technology, and basically blow up the whole deal. Apple wants that legal clarity before putting any ink on paper.
And this brings us right to a massive geopolitical collision in Washington. On one side, you've got the immense industrial needs of an American corporate giant. And on the exact opposite side, you have some very severe national security concerns. It's a highly complex situation, and to really understand what's at stake here, we need to look at both sides of this argument completely impartially.
This collision creates 2 really distinct but entirely coherent viewpoints. On the national security side, House China Committee Chair John Molinar and others warned that this move would seriously deepen American dependence on Chinese supply chains, right at the exact moment Washington is actively trying to decouple. They're basically asking, is short-term cost relief really worth normalizing a supplier with alleged ties to the People's Liberation Army? Now, on the other side, Apple's defenders make a really strong argument for cost relief. They point out that supplier diversification is just basic, responsible risk management during a crisis. They argue CXMT offers highly capable memory at much saner prices, and that honestly, seeking a solution to a genuine supply crisis is just Apple fulfilling its fiduciary duty to its customers and shareholders. And like I said, both arguments make a lot of sense depending on how you look at it.
If we take a quick look back at recent history, the precedent here is actually pretty unflattering for Apple. Back in 2022, Apple considered sourcing from YMTC, which is another blacklisted Chinese memory maker, but they quickly backed off after members of Congress basically threatened legislative consequences. Notably, both YMTC and CXMT were recently restored to that 1260H list. So look, Apple already knows the intense political heat this kind of move generates, and that just highlights exactly how desperate they are for memory right now to even be trying this all over again. Now, there is a major technical distinction here that actually calms a lot of the initial investor panic. CXMT makes cheap, high-volume commodity DRAM, the standard memory used in everyday PCs and phones. What they don't make is HBM, or high bandwidth memory. HBM is that incredibly profitable stacked memory that feeds AI accelerators and really drives earnings for companies like Micron. So if Apple buys from CXMT, it isn't actually threatening the broader AI chip war at all. This is strictly a fight for cheap commodity RAM. The cutting-edge AI memory frontier? Completely untouched by this.
But make no mistake, CXMT is absolutely not some technological backwater. Late last year, they demonstrated production-ready, ultra-fast DDR5 modules. In fact, their chips have actually been found under the hood of retail Corsair Vengeance kits. Plus, major players like Dell and HP have already quietly adopted Chinese-made RAM in certain region-bound systems. Because CXMT has very little incentive to chase the whole AI gold rush, they are perfectly positioned to offer exactly the high-performance commodity RAM Apple desperately needs, at a price the big three just won't match anymore.
Okay, so we know why Apple needs it, and we definitely know CXMT can provide it. But here is the deeper corporate irony that nobody at Apple really wants to say out loud about this current squeeze. We kind of have to ask the big question: who actually helped cause this commodity memory shortage in the first place?
The origin of this shortage is honestly fascinating. Years ago, during the last major memory downturn, Apple's notoriously aggressive price negotiations pushed DRAM margins so low they actually turned negative. That deeply punishing environment totally discouraged suppliers from making the very capacity investments that would have, softened today's blow. Basically, they learned the hard way not to build ahead of demand. Which brings us right to today's massive memory shortage. So the buyer now lobbying Washington for an emergency fourth supplier? Yeah, they're actually one of the very forces that helped set this whole fire.
Zooming out for a second, this entire story is just a masterclass in what supply chain vulnerability looks like under extreme stress. When you don't command the actual production, the shortage ends up writing your policy for you. The most powerful hardware company on planet Earth is literally willing to spend major political capital to court a supplier its own government flags as a military risk. Why? Simply because it cannot buy its way out of this problem anywhere else. It's a really striking realization of total dependence.
Now, the obvious retort you'll hear floating around Washington is, well, what about reshoring? And it's true. Companies like Micron, Samsung, and SK Hynix are all actively expanding their manufacturing capacity inside the US right now. But there is a very stark timeline contrast here. Those reshored fabs will not produce at volume until 2027 or maybe even beyond. Meanwhile, Apple's reality is that they need cheap commodity memory right now to maintain their margins and their product lines today. They simply cannot wait for 2027, which is exactly why they are hitting the pavement and lobbying the administration today.
What you should really take away from this explainer is a bracing lesson in raw industrial reality. As the source material perfectly states, if Apple, with all its leverage, all its cash, all its contracts, can't buy its way out of the squeeze and is reduced to lobbying for blacklisted chips, then neither can you. The era of limitless, cheap memory, it's over for the foreseeable future. The only move left for companies is incredible discipline. Buy what you need, right-size what you have, and just adapt to the new normal.
And that brilliantly illustrates the crux of this entire situation. The memory squeeze has officially crossed from a basic budgeting problem straight into a geopolitical one. It leaves us with one final incredibly provocative question to consider. If the most powerful hardware company on Earth doesn't actually control its own supply chain when push comes to shove, just how fragile is our global reliance on these components truly? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope these facts really helped illuminate the invisible gears turning behind the tech we use every single day. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.